Mr. Su Wei is the General Director of Climate Change Department in the China National Development and Reform Commission, one of China's key policymakers for climate change strategies and a leading negotiator for the global climate deal. Give us a window on the remarkable transformation that is going on in China, both economically and in terms of the leadership that China is bringing to the global climate issue.
Thank you very much, Tim, and Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. At the very beginning, I would like to extend my warmest congratulations on the opening of the New York Climate Week. I think the previous speakers has been talking about the seriousness and urgency of the problem of climate change. I think the climate change threat is real and imminent. And I think it's very important that in order to have a good building, we need to lay a very solid foundation. And actually the climate change negotiations is not starting only today, but we started negotiations 20 years ago. And I think the international community has been making very joint efforts in addressing that issue even more than 30 years ago. And the United Nations adopted the Framework Convention 17 years ago, and to this day the Convention has been widely recognized as the most effective framework and the proper platform for enhancing international cooperation to address climate change. Today we have a better scientific understanding of the climate change, and climate change has become the common concern of mankind. It is a topic for not just for scientists, for politicians, for business people, but also for celebrities and ordinary people. And I think the culture of cooperation and working together, both poor and rich, developing to protect our climate is in the making. Actions is urgently, we are talking about the urgency of actions. Actions is really needed. It's just not talking about climate change, but we should act on climate to fight climate change. And the international community is faced with a long-term and arduous task. We need to ensure that international cooperation to fight climate change is based on the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the Kyoto Protocol, and to further enhance their implementation in order to achieve an ambitious, tangible outcome in Copenhagen in the coming December. The Copenhagen conference has been brought to the spotlight and become the focus of all our attentions. The United Nations Summit on climate change to be held tomorrow will provide the necessary political momentum to secure the success in Copenhagen. I think such success would lie in three things. Firstly, the developed countries should commit to deeper reductions of their emissions of greenhouse gases. Secondly, the developed countries will need to provide the financing, technology transfer and capacity building to support developing countries to adequately address the challenge of climate change. And thirdly, developing countries will, in the context of sustainable development, undertake nationally appropriate policies and measures and actions to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change. I'm confident that we will achieve a fair and equitable outcome in Copenhagen if we give full effect to the United Nations Convention, to the Kyoto Protocol and the Bali Roadmap, as well as the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and the principle of equity. Actually, China takes the threat of climate change very seriously and fully recognizes that the urgency to take actions. China has demonstrated a deep sense of responsibility for the well-being and the long-term development of humankind by adopting proactive policies, measures, and actions. And China will continue such efforts by improving and further implementing China's national climate change program. China will continue to play an effective, active, and constructive role in the negotiations and to promote the success in Copenhagen, together with other countries. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I firmly believe that the New York Climate Week will further deepen our understanding of the climate issue and enhance public awareness and nurture the spirit of responsibility and solidarity to fight climate change and to secure a better future of the mankind. Thank you very much.
Jairam Ramesh. Jairam Ramesh is the Indian Environment Minister, an economist by profession. He has also served as the Minister of State for Commerce as well as the Minister of State for Power. Mr. Minister, give us a window on how India is dealing. The example of India is going to be so terribly important to the world as India sorts through the potential conflicts between dealing with climate change and dealing with development, how you're balancing those off between the two of you. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Senator Wirth, and all that in 2 minutes. I'll just make 4 very brief points. First, India wants a deal at Copenhagen, and India is prepared to be an active player in working towards an agreement at Copenhagen. It is in our interest to have an agreement at Copenhagen because we are very climate vulnerable in more respects than one, mean sea levels, Himalayan glaciers, extreme events like rainfall, floods, and drought. So we are going to Copenhagen in a very positive and constructive state of mind. Secondly, as former Prime Minister Blair said, the perfect should not become the enemy of the good. There are building blocks of an agreement at Copenhagen on which there is already substantial international consensus, and we should now codify that consensus into a series of agreements. I give you a couple of examples: an international agreement on forestry to enable mitigation to be done in the developed countries by buying offsets in the developing world, an international agreement on extension of the clean development mechanism, an international agreement on technology sharing and technology cooperation in critical areas of relevance to climate change technology, an international agreement on adaptation for key countries, particularly the island states and in Africa, and finally, an international agreement on a beginning of financial flows for underwriting adaptation activities. I think these are 5 areas on which there is very substantial international consensus, and without waiting for a perfect solution, it is possible for us to have building blocks of an agreement based on these 5 areas. A third point I'd like to make on India. We have already announced, our Prime Minister has already announced last year, that at all points of time, our per capita emissions will always be below the per capita emissions of the developed world. That's a mitigation responsibility, an implicit mitigation responsibility we have taken, and I can assure you that at all points of time, between now and 2030, our per capita emissions will always be below the per capita emissions of the developed world. However, I do realize that when you have a large denominator, per capita of anything will always be very low. So we need to have a per capita plus approach. And this is my 4th and final point, that India is now looking actively to a per capita plus approach. We have identified a large series of explicit mitigation, not mitigation actions, but mitigation outcomes, giving specific quantitative targets for the year 2020, because as Mr. Blair said, all that we say for 2050 is meaningless because none of us will be around to be held accountable. To be really credible, we have to say, what are we going to do in the year 2020? And we are in the process of formulating domestic legislation. We are going to get Parliament's approval. We will have a domestic law which will embody in it specific mitigation targets in power, in agriculture, in transport, in buildings, in energy intensity in industry. And this would be a form of ensuring accountability and credibility to our domestic political system. The key question, of course, at Copenhagen is, how does this domestic quantitative targets, domestic implicit reduction targets, convert into international obligations? On this, we are prepared to engage in a meaningful discussion in the international community. We've just had an informal discussion, the so-called Greenland Dialogue in upstate New York, and in that we've had a very constructive exchange of views, and I can assure you that at Copenhagen, India will not be found wanting in joining the international consensus on working towards a solution that would limit the temperature increase to 2 degrees centigrade by the year 2050, as was announced at the L'Aquila Agreement in July this year. Thank you.